Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Heshi from Borough Park in appreciation for the Yad Hashem throughout history. This episode is also sponsored by the 9 Days to Redemption podcast. 9 Days to Redemption is a podcast sponsored by Yeshiva University's Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs Herenstein Center for Values and Leadership. During this season of communal mourning for the destruction of ancient Jerusalem and its temples, join Dr. Erica Brown as she encounters classical Jewish texts integrated with Rabbi Sachs's wisdom and news stories of Israel's current war. Each podcast ends with a personal challenge to bring redemption each and every day. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, of blessed memory, was a religious leader, a life peer in the House of Lords, an author, and a staunch global voice of faith and morality. The Sachs Herenstein Center, founded by Terry and Andrew Herenstein, promotes his teachings and other values-based initiatives through academic, literary, and community-based programs and supports Yeshiva University's undergraduate and graduate students to strengthen the leadership of future generations. Please click the link in the show's notes to listen to 9 Days to Redemption. To sponsor an episode of the podcast or to support the podcast, please email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, or check out the links in the show's notes below. Please subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community where I post new books, Svarim, and book deals, and so on. You can find a link in the show's notes, as well as to the Svarim Chatter YouTube and the Svarim Chatter Substack. Also, if you can please rate and review the podcast, and of course subscribe wherever it is that you listen, whether 24/6, Apple, Spotify, and so on. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Professor Jodi Magness, who is Kenan Distinguished Professor for Teaching Excellence in Early Judaism at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's the author of a number of books. In the past, we discussed her book about Masada, and she's also a distinguished archaeologist as well. And this episode, we'll be discussing her new book, which is titled Jerusalem Through the Ages, From Its Beginnings to the Crusades, published by Oxford University Press, and about Yerushalayim, the history of Yerushalayim. I think it's appropriate this episode is going to be released during the 3 weeks, 9 days, Tisha B'Av time. I think it's everyone's always thinking about the Churban, the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So it's interesting to hear about from a historian, archaeologist, about the history of Yerushalayim. Not only the Churban, not only the destruction, we're going to go before, we'll be discussing to after, but the overall history. So thank you, Professor Magness, for joining me once again.
Thank you for having me.
So, you know, we did in the past, we did an episode on Masada, and you've been interested in you're an archaeologist, and you're involved in a lot of history, and especially the history in Eretz Yisrael and the Holy Land in Israel, and all over. But why Jerusalem? Why Yerushalayim specifically? I know you've been involved in some archaeological work there. You can talk about that. But how did you become specifically so involved that you wrote this big book? And by the way, I should say the book is like almost 600 pages, big, massive book.
Over 600, yeah. Right. Well, so my involvement in Jerusalem, and I talk about this in the preface in the book, goes back to when I was an undergraduate student, because I did my undergraduate degree at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And then eventually I ended up writing my PhD dissertation, which was at the University of Pennsylvania, but I ended up writing my dissertation on a topic related to the archaeology of Jerusalem, the late Roman and Byzantine pottery of Jerusalem. And so basically since then, I've been involved in various ways in researching the archaeology of Jerusalem. So it all kind of culminated with this book. I actually did not intend to write this book. It's sort of like the Masada book. It was the case where a very persistent editor decided that I should write this book. And so in this case, there was an editor at Oxford University Press who spent years literally hounding me, trying to convince me. I was very reluctant because the book is massive, and that's because the topic of Jerusalem is massive. That's like, actually writing about Masada is much easier because the story of Masada has a beginning, middle, and end. And Jerusalem has no beginning, middle, and end. It's infinite in every way, no matter however you look at it. And not only is it infinite, but it's also a moving target in the sense that ongoing archaeological discoveries constantly change our understanding of the city's history and archaeology. So I just came back, as you know, I just came back from Israel a couple of days ago. I had spent 5 weeks in Jerusalem and visited various excavations that are going on there, which now will have to go into a revised edition of the book eventually. So it's just like, it's kind of, as I say, it's like a moving target. But that also is what makes Jerusalem so fascinating and so exciting.
Yes, and that is definitely the case. And also, there's as we'll get into, there's obviously for listeners of this podcast, there's the main interest in the Jewish aspect, but there's also obviously Muslims and Christians, and so it's so important to so many people, and there's so many structures there as well. And we'll go into that, but. Also, like you said, obviously there was a persistent editor that said, let's go write this book. But there have been other books about Jerusalem, right? There's Simon Sebag Montefiore's Jerusalem, the biography. And so I think it's important to lay out why you are the editor felt another book was necessary and how it differs. What is different about this book? What is this book doing?
Right. So yeah, there are many, and again, something that I mentioned early on, there are many other books on Jerusalem, and many of them are really excellent books. So, in fact, I start the book with the preface with a question that was asked by a friend of mine who is not an archaeologist, saying, why is another book on Jerusalem needed, right? And so my book differs in that it is a broad overview that's written by a specialist, right? So I'm not avocational. I've specialized in the archaeology of Jerusalem since, pretty much the beginning of my career. So it's by a specialist, but covers a very broad swath of the city's history and archaeology. And so in that sense, number one, it differs from some of the other books out there. Many of the other books out there are written by specialists, but they either tend to be edited volumes where you have, different chapters written on different topics by different specialists, so not one voice speaking, or they focus on a specific period in Jerusalem's history, or maybe a specific topic in Jerusalem's history. So in that sense, this book differs from most of the other books on Jerusalem that are out there.
So just to clarify a little further, so what does the book set out to do? Just structurally go, obviously, like I said, the title of the book, it's titled From the Beginning to the Crusade. So we're going to end in the Crusade period, which is about 12th century around. You're going to end. So what is the book structurally trying to do?
Well, it's basically intended to provide an overview and introduction to the archaeology or the history and archaeology of Jerusalem in various periods from its beginnings to the Crusades. So it's divided up so that there's a preface and then there's an introduction. And in the introduction, I sort of describe the topography of Jerusalem, the climate, so on. There's also a discussion in there of the historical periods. How do we periodize, right? The times that we study that belong to the past. What are our sources of information for these various periods? And so that's in the introduction. And then there's that's actually an introduction that's titled. Then there's chapter 1, which is on the explorers. So who are the early explorers of Jerusalem, going back pretty much to the 19th century through the 20th century, up to the years immediately following the 1967 war. So introducing readers to the cast of characters who they will come across as they continue to read the book. And then from that point on, from chapter 2 on, the book is divided by periods. And what I did was to focus each chapter on, for the most part, on a transitional point in the city's history. So, for example, immediately before the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586, right? So or immediately before the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70, right? So each chapter focuses on a specific point of time that is, for the most part, transitional. And my reasoning there was because I'm covering, so much time, so much history, so much archaeology, that I wanted to be able to make it easier for readers to kind of focus their attention and not have a huge number of dates and, periods of time. So that was kind of my device for kind of focusing. But that said, within each chapter, and you will have noticed this as you read through the book, within each chapter, I actually do cover the broad swath of time, but the chapters themselves are labeled, titled, so that they're focusing on, and they begin and end with that specific period or point of transition.
Yeah, and you go through the sources, and then you discuss various things about the time, whether it's the water source and the coins and the tombs and houses and structures and things like that. So, and we'll dive into some of that. Obviously, like I said, this book is, totally from beginning to end, almost 600 pages. We are not nearly getting to all that, but we'll cover some various aspects of the book. I do want to ask one general question, and this is probably a question that some listeners have as well. I'm an archaeologist who's an historian as well. when you're doing archaeology, I mean, you can just in general talk very general speaking about what that work entails, but especially on a place like Yerushalayim, like Jerusalem, where there's so much rich history for centuries and thousands of years, and everything's all mixed together. You dig deeper, you find different things at different periods. How do you, as an archaeologist, how do you separate? How do you know what's from which period? How does that work?
Right. Well, that's a great question. Boy, that requires sort of a lesson in archaeology. Archaeological methodology. It's complicated. There's not really an easy answer to that. And also, I will say before I try to answer, I will say that that Jerusalem is particularly challenging in this regard, because since it's been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. And because a lot of times when people in later periods would build whatever they built, they would dig down through earlier levels, often to reach bedrock, to found their buildings on bedrock. A lot of times early remains either are very poorly preserved or are obliterated altogether. And a lot of times, if you do have earlier remains of, let's say, monumental buildings, they might have continued in use and just been repaired over the course of centuries. And that's true for buildings and it's true for walls. And so that makes it particularly challenging, whereas on other sites like a Masada, for example, the archaeological picture, what we call the stratigraphy, is somewhat easier to deal with. So I just introduced a word, stratigraphy, which is a very key word in archaeology. The word stratigraphy comes from the Latin word strata, stratum. A stratum is a layer. And so basically the idea is that as a site is inhabited over the course of time, and people build, successively, the layers of remains accumulate one on top of the other. And maybe some of your listeners have read James Michener's The Source, which is a great, sort of way to lay it out. And you get the accumulation of layers one on top of the other. And that creates what we call stratigraphy, this kind of accumulation of layers. And so what we seek to do is to sort of identify the different layers as we dig through them and to find artifacts within those layers that will help us date those layers. That is, tell us when people built things in those layers or lived at the time those layers accumulated. And so there you get things like pottery or coins. Now, of course, scientific methods like radiocarbon dating of organic materials. And so that's basically how we do it. But again, it's really complicated in a case like Jerusalem because of the nature of the sort of continuous habitation there. And that's one of the things that creates so much uncertainty and controversy. So people who do read the book will see that there are a lot of places where I lay out, archaeologists disagree about the date of this building or, the identification of this building or how big it was, or, is it David? Is it Solomon? Is it later? Is it whatever? And part of that reason is precisely because of the nature of the remains. For example, there's a lot of discussion about how big the city was in its earliest stages, right? How much, and not only how big it was, but where it was located. Where was the settlement located? There are people now, I just read an article. So again, the moving target thing, I just read an article in the latest Israel Exploration Journal, which I found upon my return waiting for me, which argues, it's a theory that I actually mentioned in the book, which argues that the original settlement in Jerusalem was on the Temple Mount, not in the city of David, the southeastern hill to the south of the Temple Mount. And Marshall's, arguments in favor of that. So we don't even know, especially in the earliest stages, exactly where the settlement in the city was located, and how big it was. And again, this is because many of those early remains were obliterated by later overbuilding or later reuse of buildings simply then means that you can't tell when the building was originally built, right, necessarily. So there's a lot of unclarity. And I'll also mention, I know I'm going to skip forward a bit here, but this is true not just of those earlier periods. There are other periods in Jerusalem's history where there are similar controversies. So there's a chapter on Roman Jerusalem, which is after 70, when Jerusalem becomes a pagan Roman city called Aelia Capitolina that was built by the Emperor Hadrian, founded as a colony by the Roman Emperor Hadrian. He, of course, is the one who basically sparked the outbreak of the second Jewish revolt, right, the Bar Kokhba revolt, when he announced that he was going to refound Jerusalem as a pagan Roman city and establish a pagan Roman temple on the Temple Mount, a temple dedicated to Capitolina Jupiter. And so there is a huge amount of uncertainty and debate about how big the settlement was in Aelia Capitolina, originally at least, and where the camp of the 10th Legion, which was camped somewhere in Jerusalem, where the camp of the 10th Legion was located. And so that's generated a whole lot of controversy. It's gotten a lot less attention, or it had until recent years gotten a lot less attention than other periods. And I think it's because if we look at who's got a stake in Jerusalem's history, right? So you mentioned, of course, Jews, Christians, Muslims, right? So a lot of the attention on Jerusalem's history and archaeology is focused on periods when you had an Israelite or Jewish population, or a Christian population, or a Muslim population. But there's nobody around now to argue for the Romans. Stakeholders, there are no Romans around, right? And we're like, hey, wait a minute, we want to know about Roman Jerusalem. So, Roman Jerusalem hadn't attracted until recent years all that much attention. Now there's actually a lot of work being done on it. But yeah, so I've greatly oversimplified and really didn't go into details to answer your question, but it's a really great question, right? How do archaeologists work? How do we do what we do? And that would be a topic for a whole nother book, I think. So anyway,
they have another book idea, but yeah. About was Hadrian also, was that the time period when they changed the name from Israel to Palestine? The Romans decided they wanted to obliterate any remembrance of the Jews.
That's absolutely correct, because the name of the province had been Judea up until that point. Judea, of course, had originally, the name goes back to Judah, the kingdom of Judah, and I have a chapter in the book on Judahite Jerusalem. And so that was one of the things that Hadrian did after the Bar Kokhba revolt ended to punish the Jews for the rebellion, was to change the name of the province, which effectively, because people were known, you were known as the inhabitants of, right? The Jews were Judeoi, right? Judeoi are basically Judeans. So if you change the name of the province, you've basically obliterated the name of the people who live in that province. They're no longer Judeans, right? And that's when he changes the name to Syria Palestine. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah, and he did it for that reason, so that the history of that name comes from the history of the name Palestine comes from here. Is from Hadrian. That's
right. Yeah.
Well,
and that name Palestine was actually a revival of Philistia, right? He revived the ancient kingdom of the Philistines. He went back to that, and that's a revival of that.
But it's just funny. It was this kind of colonialism to punish the Jews. The Romans were going to punish them and change the name to obliterate them. That's where this all started.
Well, and you mentioned colonialism, and I think people don't realize that there was lots of colonialism in the ancient world. I mean, the Romans established colonies, but Jerusalem was established as a Roman colony, right? Colonia Aelia Capitolina. The Greeks established colonies all over the Mediterranean world. The Phoenicians established colonies now. So, I mean, this notion of colonialism, not saying it's in the same exact sense as we use it today, but colonialism has a long history in the ancient world, including in Jerusalem.
Yes, absolutely. The ancient world was a very different place than today. Even modern notions of colonialism and different things, the ancient world is a different place. So you start off the book with explorers, and you can mention them. Either we can mention them here or at the end, just to give it like a cast of characters type of thing. But if you want to mention some of the, because they'll come up who they are, there's something you did in the Masada book. I read the Masada book. Now I read this. I'm like, I recognize some of these. They're very similar.
That's right. Yeah, a lot of them are these, this interest that develops in the 19th century, and particularly among these Europeans. A lot of them were British, but not only, who did some really important work in Jerusalem. Right. So anybody who's visited, of your listeners, I know many of them have visited Jerusalem, and they'll be familiar, for example, with Wilson's Arch, right? Or Robinson's Arch, or these are named after, these early explorers, right? I think for your listeners, one of the ones who might be more interesting is a little bit lesser known. He was French. His name was Raymond Weil, Weill, And the reason is he was the first Jewish archaeologist to excavate in Jerusalem. He excavated at the southern end of the city of David and discovered a very important inscription, the Theodotos inscription, which I also talk about in the book, which is a dedicatory inscription of a synagogue. We don't have the synagogue building, but it's a dedicatory inscription of a synagogue that was dedicated by somebody named Theodotos, son of Etanos, who's described in the inscription as an archisynagogos, the leader of a synagogue. And so he discovered that inscription. It's a really important piece of evidence for a synagogue in Jerusalem that predates 70. So there was a synagogue somewhere, apparently to the south of the Temple Mount, before 70 that inscription would have gone with. The inscription itself was found in in a cistern with some other debris and stuff like that. So your listeners would probably be interested in reading about him. I had a hard time getting a photograph of him, by the way. I had to contact Roni Reich, who was very kind and sent me a photo that I could use. One of my personal favorites is another coincidentally French archaeologist and scholar named Charles Clermont-Ganneau, who I came across very early on in my dissertation research, because every time I would have an idea that I thought was a great idea, like I'd have this wow, I think that this is this, I would find out that all the way back at the end of the 19th century, Charles Clermont-Ganneau had already published this. It was like the guy was a genius, apparently, because, he had a lot less information than we have today. And yet he came up with these great, he was a polyglot. He also is indirectly probably known to some of your listeners because he had a hand in this very sensational episode where there was a claim that early copies of ancient scrolls had been discovered in the area of the Dead Sea. What might have been copies of Dead Sea Scrolls, very controversial. And he examined them and declared them to be forgeries. There's a whole long story behind that. So he's involved with that, and I talk about that also when I talk about him. But one of the things that you may have noticed if you looked at the explorers carefully is that although I go up to the years after 1967, I only included deceased explorers. I didn't include anybody who's still alive. And the reason is I didn't want to, because then I would have gotten into a whole long morass. What if I included some people, but I didn't include, how do you include, everybody? And I just decided I'm not going to include anybody who's still alive. I don't want to offend anybody, so I'm only going to include those who are already deceased. And that's why it kind of goes up to Yigal Shiloh. And in fact, so right before I talk about Yigal Shiloh, I talk about Benjamin Mazar, who I'd already written about in the draft of this chapter. And then very tragically, actually, as I was working on this, Benjamin Mazar's granddaughter, Eilat Mazar, passed away. She was only 64 years old. It was a huge shock to the archaeological community. Eilat is mentioned in her work, she's mentioned all throughout the book. And so at the very last stages, I added Eilat into that list of explorers. And I got a wonderful photo of her from her uncle, Amichai Mazar. There's kind of a little archaeological dynasty of Mazars in Israel. And so you have Amichai, her uncle, and then Benjamin, and then Eilat. So, and I end the explorers with one of my own professors, undergraduate professors, Yigal Shiloh, and a whole long story about that.
Just by the way, you mentioned the controversy with the scrolls. That's the Shapira affair, and so recently I did a podcast episode about Christian David Ginsburg and his involvement in that. And now it's been reopened with Dershowitz recently in the past couple of years. Yeah, Dershowitz. So I know there's a whole. We'll leave that for a different time.
Yeah, and the consensus looks. So it's not my expertise, right? I mean, I do actually, as you know, I've written about Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls. I have a book about it. But my expertise is on the archaeology of Qumran. I'm not a scroll scholar per se, so I would not be qualified to look at. And by the way, one of the problems is that we really have there are no copies of the actual. Anyway, there's a whole. But I wouldn't be qualified to on my own evaluate the authenticity of the scrolls. But I will say that there seems to be a majority consensus among scholars, not universal, but a majority consensus that the Shapira fragments were in fact forgeries, that they could not be authentic. And as I said, Clermont-Ganneau, did look at them and say that they were fake. And just from my limited acquaintance with his scholarship. I honestly do think he was a genius. And so if he looked at them and he said they were forgeries, then I would go along with what he said. So, yeah.
All right. So now let's start off. Obviously, like I said, the book is extensive, exhaustive, and so we're not going to get into everything. But just to give run through an overview, especially here, like I said, the time period this is being released, everyone's interested in hearing about the history of Yerushalayim and Jerusalem. They've been there, they're familiar with it, or not, but they are, familiar from afar, at least today. So let's talk about the origins of the city of Jerusalem. And it's important also to talk about, and you alluded to some of this earlier, where we're talking about geographically, exactly in the area of Jerusalem today, how big it was, and what time period. And we'll work through the time periods, you go through just at least quickly.
Right. Well, so today, and again, I know that many of your listeners are familiar with Jerusalem, but just for people who may not be, today, when you go to Jerusalem, there's an area in the heart of the city that's called the Old City. The Old City is more or less square in shape, and it's outlined by walls that date to the Ottoman period, so to the 16th century. But those walls are built over the remains of earlier lines of walls. So today, a lot of people who visit the Old City of Jerusalem look at it and they think, Old City, that's the ancient city of Jerusalem. But that area that is enclosed within the walls of the Old City today does not correspond necessarily with the area where the ancient city was located. So the area of the settlement within the city has kind of moved around over time, sometimes corresponding with or overlapping with the area within the walls of the Old City today, but not always, not necessarily so. So and now again, I'm going to disregard the mound on the mount. This theory that the earliest settlement was on the Temple Mount itself. I'm going to disregard that theory. It is a minority theory, and I am not convinced by it. Even though, again, there's a very robust argument in its favor in this latest issue of the Israel Exploration Journal. But anyway, most archaeologists believe that the earliest settlement, and I along with them, believe that the earliest settlement in Jerusalem was located on a small hill to the south of the Old City today that lies completely outside the walls of the Old City. It's to the south of the Temple Mount. And that hill is what many people call the City of David. It's also sometimes called the Eastern Hill or the Southeastern Hill or the Lower City. In the book, I use the term Southeastern Hill rather than City of David because I want to try and be as neutral as possible. And in fact, one of the issues addressed in this IEJ article is the use of the term City of David and what that originally referred to. So I'm just going to use the term Southeastern Hill. So it's a little hill. It's about 11 acres in size. And it's just like a spur that comes out to the south of the Temple Mount. And it's outside the walls of the Old City today. And that apparently is where the first people who settled in Jerusalem originally settled about 5,000 years ago. So we're talking way before David and Solomon lived. And they apparently chose this specific spot because it's closest to the perennial source of fresh water, which is the Gihon Spring. The Gihon Spring comes out of the ground at the eastern foot of that hill. The hill also offers the advantage of being protected on two of its three sides by deep valleys. On one side, you have the Kidron Valley, that's on the east. On the west, the Tyropean Valley. To the north, the bedrock rises up as you go north towards the Temple Mount. And so that apparently is where the earliest settlement was located. Now, exactly where on that hill the settlement was and how big it was is the subject of a lot of debate among archaeologists. So, and this again has to do with the obliteration of later remains of early remains by later periods. But for sure, the area around the spring, that is around and above the spring, up to the top of the crest of the hill, that area seems to have been pretty intensively settled and fortified. But how much farther along that spur the settlement extended is the subject of a lot of debate. And one of the things that readers will encounter as they go through the book is a very important area that's being excavated in Jerusalem, that's been excavated now for a number of years, is an area called the Givati parking lot. It's a weird name for an archaeological site, but it was originally a parking lot. So it was a big parking lot located to the south of the Temple Mount, sort of if you go south from Al-Aqsa Mosque. And it's at the top of the area of this southeastern hill. And this parking lot there's no more parking lot there, but it's still called the Givati parking lot. So this big enclosed area has been undergoing excavation for quite a while, and archaeologists have been digging down successively through the various layers, further and further down. And along the way have found a lot, because one of the problems of digging in Jerusalem, and this is true of like a lot of these ancient cities that are still inhabited today, whether it's Athens or Rome or Istanbul, is that archaeologists are limited by how much you can dig, because people are living in the city. I mean, you can't dig up people's houses and streets and shops because we're archaeologists and we want to see what's underneath. So the Givati parking lot has provided an unusual opportunity in Jerusalem to excavate a fairly large area in a very key part of the city, and to sort of trace the development of, what happens in this area over the course of time, beginning from the top and then working your way down. And I had the good fortune to visit the Givati parking lot excavations a couple of times during my recent visit, and had a very nice tour of it by the excavators. And they're now down in very early levels. They're now down in Bronze Age and Iron Age levels. And the remains that they're bringing to light are again going to cause us to modify our understanding of where the settlement in the city was located in these very earliest periods. And one of the things that they found, by the way, and it's really weird, and it was in the press, so people who look this up can find it online, sort of, they found a huge moat or trench that is hewn into the bedrock. So all the way down at the very bottom in the bedrock, this enormous sort of moat or trench that's cut east-west, that appears to be a kind of maybe a moat or a trench that would have protected the northern side of the southeastern hill, because that side was not protected by valleys. The bedrock rises up and goes towards the Temple Mount. The problem is that they were able to trace the extent of the trench on either side, but then it kind of continues, and they don't know how far it goes on either direction. And it's also a little bit problematic in terms of dating when it was cut, because all you have is the trench that's cut. You can see stuff is built on it. So if you have later things that are built on it, you can say, well, it must predate when later things were built on it, but exactly when it was cut, very hard to say. It's also got some enigmatic features. It's got these weird kind of grooves, big grooves cut into it. Anyway, weird things. So all of this to say that we have here another case of Jerusalem being the moving target, where these ongoing excavations are definitely going to cause us to, rethink our understanding of where the settlement was located, how far it was located. They're actually arguing that area was the heart of the original city, as opposed to other parts of the southeastern hill. So we'll have to see what they come up with. Another thing that I'll mention that I saw in their excavations is I have a very long, well, not long, but I have a detailed discussion of an important fortress from the Hasmonean period. So the time of the Maccabees, right? That's called the Acre Fortress, which is described in the Book of Maccabees. And anyway, it's a fortress that was built by Antiochus IV, and was a fortress that, is described as having guarded access to the Temple Mount. Archaeologists for years have argued about where that fortress was located in Jerusalem. And the previous excavators, so there's a different expedition now in the Givati parking lot, but the previous group of excavators, when they excavated the Hasmonean period levels, identified remains that they discovered as part of the Acre Fortress. And I have a discussion of this in my book. I think that what they describe is very convincing, but now visiting the ongoing excavations, this newer team has found, in fact, that those remains that were previously identified as part of the Acre Fortress don't appear to be part of a fortress at all, and it's kind of demolishing the whole picture of what we thought now that the Acre Fortress looked like. So it's a whole. So again, it's all to say that it just goes to show how complicated Jerusalem is, and how how much of a moving target it is to kind of, so at some point I like came back from this trip and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm already going to have to like write, I don't know when I'm going to do it, but at some point a revised edition that includes, but it's like every day there's something new that comes out,
Which makes sense. So we'll get to it. We're not even, like obviously, like you said, the book does here, we're bounce around. You mentioned the Hasmonean period, even though we're going to go earlier. So we're still in the early period, and before it's conquered by Dovid HaMelech, before that, as you call it, Israelite Jerusalem, I think you call it, or Judahite Jerusalem. So before that, but what's and you can get to that in a second, but what's the size of this period you were just talking about, the size of early Jerusalem? Do we know how big it was and how many people lived there?
Yeah, so that's the problem, right? So so we don't know how big it was in that very earliest period. We don't know exactly where the settlement was located or how big it was. And therefore, that affects the estimates of the population size, right? Because depending on how big you think the settlement was, then you would estimate how many people were living there. But it was small. It was tiny. And maybe I think 500 to 1,000 people would be a reasonable maximum estimate. Which then leads to kind of the whole question of, well, what is going on here? Like, what kind of a thing is this? So it's really more like a kind of it appears to be kind of more of a fortified stronghold than, a real city, let's say. And that, then we can get into Israelite yet, but then that goes kind of mushes into what is our understanding of what the city then looked like when David takes it and it becomes the capital of his kingdom. And what did it look like as the capital of, the kingdom of David and Solomon? If you kind of read the biblical accounts, you would expect a big fortified, major capital city, but the archaeology doesn't seem to support that view, right? So, that's what leads to a lot of the debates among archaeologists.
Right, and as you said, listen, the archaeology is always moving. We know what it says, as you say, in the biblical accounts. So we know from Chumash, we know from Nach, and we know what's going on. So we get to Dovid HaMelech, David's conquest, and Solomon, King Shlomo. We know we have that. So talk a little bit about that, and you discuss this at length in the book, and where it was located then, and the size of the city. Then these same kind of questions, where it was located, the size, and what because people today are familiar, as you mentioned earlier, with the old city and David. Yeah,
exactly. It's exactly so. Look, it becomes known as the city of David. The city of David is basically Jerusalem as David. When David takes the city, it becomes the city of David. So the previous city, which is the Bronze Age / Jebusite city, that's the chapter Jebusite Jerusalem. And the reason is because the biblical account describes the inhabitants of Jerusalem when David takes the city as Jebusites. So it's basically that city. So the question is how big is it, right? And that's the problem. We can't say. Because the remains are so scarce, the archaeological remains are so scarce and so relatively limited, many archaeologists argue that the biblical descriptions of Davidic Jerusalem, and for that matter, Jerusalem of Solomon, are exaggerated, right? That they're not accurate, that they were later exaggerated by the biblical writers because the biblical account wasn't actually written until, centuries after the time of David and Solomon. So the argument is, well, when the biblical writers wrote their description of Jerusalem, they exaggerated. And maybe they did. There are even people who argue that David and or Solomon were entirely fictional, that they never even existed. I don't agree with that point of view, but there are people who argue that. And this is something that actually I try to deal with quite a bit in the book, which is the problem of trying to correlate historical information with archaeological evidence, because history and archaeology are both about the past, but they provide different kinds of information. And that information isn't necessarily always complementary. And so trying to use archaeology as a tool to verify or prove what's written in the Bible is problematic, because again, there are different kinds of sources of information, and you have to know how to use each type of information in a critical way. So I think that's part of the problem. People come and they see, archaeologists have dug in the city of David. So does that prove, that David existed, or does it prove that Jerusalem looked like what the Bible described in that time? And that's not necessarily going to happen.
So now when you get to Dovid HaMelech and he, they start building the Beis HaMikdash, which we'll talk about. You've mentioned the Temple Mount, and this is something that was smaller, and we'll get to Herod later. But at the time when that occurs and that's built and the expansion of the city, you can elaborate a little bit on that. And by the way, and as I said, and as you said exhaustively, the book is by far more. But here we're just giving a little bit of an overview of the city.
Right. So I do, and as you mentioned earlier, each one of these chapters on a different period is divided so that first I do the historical background and then I do the archaeology. And so in that particular chapter, which is Israelite Jerusalem, I do in the history talk about our information from the Bible mostly, but not only, also from archaeological comparanda for Solomon's temple, right? The first temple. Archaeologically, however, there's nothing to say about Solomon's temple because we have no archaeological remains of Solomon's temple. So really, when we talk about that temple, it's based on literary descriptions. It's based on comparisons with other temples in the area from that period. But there's no actual physical archaeological remains of the temple building itself, nor, for that matter, are there identifiable remains of the palace that Solomon purportedly built for himself at the southern end of the Temple Mount, right, to the south of the area of the temple. There are remains outside of that, in that area, the area of the Ophel, which is located just to the south, sort of that area between the Temple Mount and the southeastern hill. But otherwise, archaeologically, there's really nothing to say about the temple. Yeah, sorry, I always disappoint people with that. And also, since you mentioned Herod, that's true also of the Second Temple, both the pre-Herodian and the Herodian Second Temple. We don't have remains of any of those the actual temple buildings, at least not in situ. We do have, of course, from Herod's temple and also even some earlier versions of the Second Temple, we have remains of the area around the Temple Mount, right? But of the actual temple building itself, there's nothing, right? Nothing that we can identify.
Yeah, we have the Kaisel, we have the Western Wall. And I want to go back just a second. You were talking about the issues sometimes with archaeology versus history. And you mentioned this in the book on page 87. And I want to mention, I found this to be very, very interesting, which is, as you're talking about how some come across the city and they say, well, you read Nach and you say, well, it's supposed to be this big city and now it's small and it was the capital. What's going on? And as you point out that, and you quote, is that, yes, that even today you make the analogy to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, or to capitals in various states, and even in Israel today, you say Tel Aviv versus Jerusalem, and as you point out, 2,000 years from now, archaeologists could assume that Tel Aviv, not Jerusalem, better fits the profile of the capital of the state of Israel. Similarly, future archaeologists would hardly guess that Harrisburg, as the 13th largest city in Pennsylvania, or Tallahassee, as the 7th largest city in Florida, are state capitals. So, and you continue the analogy is that sometimes these are the shortcomings of archaeology. Just if you're just working with it, and you can say, well, this is what we see, so this must be tiny. It must not have been the capital, whatever it is. You need to take that and I thought the analogy was very important because it really brought out. Wait, hold. That's a very good point. So that is worth pointing out and going back to your earlier point. And so
yeah. So it means again, it's a matter of how you read the biblical account and not necessarily assuming that it's got to be literally accurate and true, right? I mean, Jerusalem still could be the capital of, there was a city, there was something there was, whatever you want to call it, a fortified stronghold, whatever it was. And it was the capital, even if it doesn't fit our imagination of what a capital should look like, right? That's on us, not on them.
Right, exactly. We read something and we have our modern conceptions of what it is, and or do archaeological digs and say, well, hold on, this doesn't make sense. But again, it's doing it with modern conceptions as opposed to and of course we can obviously read the full history in Nach. So when you go to then there's Chizkiyah's the Salom Tunnel that probably many listeners I recall walking through that many listeners have gone through. You can explain what it is for those that aren't familiar and when do we know when at least archaeologically when does that come?
Well, and that it's unbelievable that, that's also debated, right? So many of your listeners may have walked through Hezekiah's, what's often called Hezekiah's tunnel, or sometimes the Siloam Tunnel. So let's just say popularly it's called Hezekiah's Tunnel because it is assumed by many, including many archaeologists and scholars, that this is a water system that was cut by Hezekiah. King Hezekiah was king of Judah on the eve of an invasion by the Assyrians in 701 BCE. And it still got water flowing through it. So it flows today from the Gihon Spring, and it ends up in a big pool on the southwestern side of the southeastern hill, the Pool of Siloam. And by the way, I also visited now ongoing excavations in the area of the Pool of Siloam. And there's a whole nother thing going on there where now there's a suggestion that the big Pool of Siloam that's being uncovered and that's still undergoing excavation was not originally the Pool of Siloam. The Pool of Siloam was actually at the outlet of what is Hezekiah's Tunnel. Anyway, there's a whole nother complication. Nothing about Jerusalem is easy. But unbelievably, so it's all, it's often been assumed there is a dedicatory inscription associated with that tunnel that was discovered in the late 19th century by a couple of boys who were playing in the pool or the area of the pool at the outlet of the tunnel. They were from the neighboring village. And this inscription is the dedicatory inscription of the tunnel. When it was completed, it was inscribed. It's inscribed in Biblical Hebrew. It was high up on the wall. And it was actually removed at that time and ended up in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, where it's still on display today. So if somebody wants to go and look at it, they can. And so it's always been assumed that this was, this is a tunnel that is associated with Hezekiah's preparation of the city of Jerusalem in advance of the Assyrian invasion or siege in 701 BCE. Now, and I do mention this in the book, there are other opinions among some archaeologists. Some date the tunnel to before the time of Hezekiah or argue that it was started before that. Some of them date it to after that. So even there, we call it, and again, popularly we call it Hezekiah's Tunnel. But now there are debates about whether, in fact, it is associated with Hezekiah.
So then we get to the conquest, the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, and then the rebuilding of it and the second Beis HaMikdash. So that's going to be the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, the first temple, and the so if you want to talk about that, and that really is what you mentioned. One of the things that issues archaeologists, it gets destroyed and everything gets destroyed. But you do talk a little bit about that before moving on to the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the second temple.
Right. Well, one of the things that we archaeologists like to say is that archaeologists love destruction. It's a terrible thing to say. But the reason why archaeologists like destruction is because when you have a sudden violent destruction, it's like a time capsule. Everything that was in use at that point in time is buried and generally preserved. Whereas if you have just continuous occupation for long periods of time, let's say you have a big monumental building that's used for a long period, as it's used, it gets swept, it gets repaired, it gets, and continues to be used. So it's very hard to identify what was going on at any one period in time. And so 586 BCE is a very important point in the history of Jerusalem for archaeologists, not only, but also for archaeologists, because we do get, these kind of destruction levels that have preserved artifacts that help us understand what everyday life was like in Jerusalem at that time and what the city looked like. The interesting thing about when we get to that chapter is Judahite Jerusalem. When we get to that chapter, one of the things that has happened by that point is that the city has expanded beyond the original settlement on the southeastern hill and the Temple Mount. It's expanded onto the next hill over to the west, which is the southwestern hill or western hill or upper city. And that is a very sizable area that's added to the city. And that area also was enclosed within a fortification wall, apparently by Hezekiah on the eve of the Assyrian invasion in 701 BCE. I talk about it in that chapter. There's some debate among archaeologists about exactly when the settlement began to expand onto the Western Hill. Was it in the late 9th century or in the 8th century BCE? But at any rate, by the time Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BCE, it's a much larger city than it had been in the time of David and Solomon. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And we have partly at least thanks to that destruction, we have a wealth of material culture. That is, the kinds of artifacts, the kinds of objects that were in use among the Judahite population. And I talk about that. I talk about, as you, I think, mentioned, I've sections that talk about sometimes the pottery, things like sealings to seal documents or objects, tombs I talk about. So that actually is one of the longer chapters because we do get a lot of information about the city.
Yeah, and there's various pictures throughout the book. Most of them are in black and white. There are some color photographs as well. Then you go in and you discuss in depth the Hasmonean Jerusalem that comes up later on, which is something that Hasmonean Jerusalem is something that kind of come up on the podcast here before. Obviously, about Hanukkah, this comes up somewhat, but you can kind of, and then there's Herodian Jerusalem. But if you want to just give it kind of put those together, even though they're different. Right. Herodian listeners, I just did an episode of Professor Martin Goodman, his new book on Herod, so be familiar with Herod, but this is about Herodian Jerusalem, and that's really the expansion of the Beis HaMikdash, of the temple, right, and the Temple Mount before the destruction of the Romans.
Yes, and that is by far the longest chapter in the book, by far. And how not? I mean, it's impossible because we just have so much both historical information, but also so much in the way of archaeology. Not just the area of the Temple Mount and Herod's rebuilding of the temple, but also all the areas around it, other parts of the city. Again, just, as I was in Jerusalem just now, one of the things that I was able to do was to walk along this stepped road leading from the Pool of Siloam all the way up to the area of the Temple Mount, which was the original pilgrimage road, which people can visit. We were talking about being claustrophobic, by the way. If you're claustrophobic, you probably don't want to do that. But if you're not claustrophobic, it's really an interesting thing to do. And excavations are ongoing. They're actually still excavating along the area of this road and doing all kinds of restoration work so that people will be able to visit it easily moving forward. So, yeah, I mean, I don't even know where to start with that chapter because it's as you see, it's huge, right? It's huge, and it's like everything else. It's complicated. There are lots of parts in it where there are all sorts of debates among archaeologists about different aspects of the city. For example, one of the interesting things is that the excavations along this stepped pilgrimage road from the Pool of Siloam up to the Temple Mount, everybody always thought, well, this must be part of Herod's rebuilding of the area of the Temple Mount, the areas around it. And it turns out actually that the latest coins that have been discovered under the paving of that road are from the time of Pontius Pilate, which means 26 to 36 CE, which is after the time of Herod. So it's clear from that and also from other excavations around the area outside the Temple Mount that although the temple itself was apparently rebuilt by Herod, the construction work on the larger area of the Temple Mount and the areas around it continued for decades after Herod's death, which isn't so surprising considering, how extensive the construction was.
So exactly. And the Hasmonean chapter is a little bit smaller where you discuss that. And really, listen, there's more to get into there, but let's move on. Let's discuss more about more about Herodian Jerusalem, especially for the time period of year that we're in. And I want to, what would, just if possible, like what would it be at the end? We're talking at the end before the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. The last one, the second one, before the temple is destroyed. What would Jerusalem have looked like? Was that the old city? What would try to kind of give like envision like based on at least on the history and archaeology, like a walking tour of what that would be before it was destroyed?
Well, and so to start with, just like everything else, there are debates about the extent of the city on the eve of its destruction in 70. How big was it? How far did it extend? For sure, it extended south of the area of the old city today to include what's called Mount Zion, which is sort of the southern end of the southwestern hill. It's today outside the walls of the old city. And it also included the southeastern hill, right? The city of David. That area was enclosed within the walls. How far the north the city extended is a matter of some debate. Josephus describes a series of 3 walls protecting the city to its north, the innermost and earliest of the walls, which is Hasmonean, as the first wall, and then a second wall, not sure who built it, maybe the Hasmoneans, maybe Herod, and then a third wall that was built or started by Herod's grandson, Herod Agrippa I, and then completed by the Jews on the eve of the outbreak of the first Jewish revolt against the Romans. And so there's a lot of debate about where the second and third walls are located. Do we have remains that we can identify with them? I've come around to sort of, because of archaeology, I didn't originally agree with this, but I do think now that the third wall, the outermost and northernmost of these three walls, is a line of wall that's found about 400 meters to the north of the old city today. You can still see the line of that wall, that actually is originally the third wall. I think it was reused by Hadrian when he rebuilt Aelia Capitolina, but that's another story. And if we assume that, then what it means is that the area of Jerusalem within the walls, at the time of its destruction in 70, was much bigger than the area within the walls of the old city today. So that's the first thing. Now, within that, of course, you have the area of the Temple Mount, which is on the sort of southeastern side of the city, or eastern side of the city. And as you move westwards from the area of the Temple Mount across the top of the southwestern hill, you get into an area where there were administrative official buildings. The Palace of Herod was located all the way at the sort of western end there. So that was kind of the area. And then if you move a little bit south onto the top of the Western Hill, moving south, or the Southwestern Hill, you get into an area that was the houses of the Jerusalem elite. And some of those houses were excavated by Nachman Avigad back in the 1960s and the late 60s and into the 70s. Then again, if you continue even further south into the area of the Southeastern Hill, or the City of David, we have that stepped road that I mentioned before. Moving north, very interesting. The area to the north, the area enclosed within the third wall, seems to have been less built up than the other areas further to the south. Not so surprising, because that area was more recently settled than the other areas, which were more the heart of the city in earlier periods leading up to that point. So yeah, there's a wealth of it. I should also mention that Herod's palace, which would be in the area of today's Armenian Garden, that its northern end was protected by a series of three towers, basically a fortress with three towers. And that area is in the area that's called the Citadel today, David's Citadel. So anyway, I mean, we didn't mention this, but I end the book with a series of suggested walking tours. And in the walking tours, I point out many of the sites like these, where you can actually start at one point and then walk through and then see many of these monuments that I talk about in various chapters.
And I didn't mention that, so it's good you mentioned it. Another thing to mention is that even though we're really focusing a lot of the archaeology and the archaeological history throughout the book, like I said, when it comes to Bat the Churban and the destruction, you do give the general overview relying on Josephus and others. I mean, you do give the history, the story as well, before going into archaeology. For purpose of this podcast, like I said, Herod, I have the previous episode last week, and just on the whole revolt, I have the 3-part series a few years ago that I did with Professor Guy Rogers. I've done his book. So I've done that kind of thing on the podcast. We didn't want to go so much into that. But when we do have, as you mentioned, what the city of Jerusalem was like at the time of Herod, at the time of the destruction in 70, what happened after? What happened post-Churban, right after? What was left of it after the destruction? And then before we get to the Roman city of Aelia Capitolina, what's in between those two periods?
And here now again, after having just visited these ongoing excavations, I'm going to have to do some further modifications, because our view of the city traditionally has been that it was lying in ruins, basically. The 10th Legion was camped among the ruins of the city after 70, right? So the 10th Legion, by the way, was the legion that had participated in the siege of Jerusalem in 70. They also, it's a very interesting legion. They had participated before that in the siege of Gamla. Some of your listeners may be familiar with that. And also that's the legion that was at the siege of Masada. So it's a very interesting legion, but they were camped in Jerusalem after 70. One of the big debates among archaeologists is exactly where was the camp of the 10th Legion located. But our sort of general view of the city in that period, after 70, but before, the Hadrian rebuilds it as Aelia Capitolina, has been kind of like, well, yeah, the legion's there, but basically the city's lying in ruins. And now excavations are identifying remains that date to that period between the two revolts, between the first revolt and the second revolt, meaning between 70 and let's say 132. And one of the things that I saw is a huge building alongside that stepped paved road that I talked about, a huge building which dates to this period between the two revolts. So we do have remains that are beginning to come to light, or at least that are being identified, that date to this period, which indicates that it's not just that the city was desolate and only the 10th Legion was camped there, but apparently there was some more activity. One of the big questions is whether there were Jews present among, these people who are kind of living there among, the ruins and everything. There seems to be some evidence which suggests that that's certainly possible. In that chapter, I do talk about remains that are definitely Jewish, not inside the area of the city, but to the north in the area of Shuafat, where remains of a sort of a settlement that dates to the period between the two revolts was found in excavations a number of years ago, and where the remains indicate that what you have there apparently are upper class or elite Jews who were living, just outside the area of the city. So it's a really interesting period. One of the problems, by the way, with identifying remains of this period has to do with how we date things in archaeology. And in this case, what's been so hard to do is to pinpoint pottery types that we can date to precisely between those revolts, right? Because pottery generally has long time spans. So can you say that, the pottery that we found here definitely dates after 70, but before 132, let's say? And that's been one of the problems. That it also has to do with the lack of interest that I mentioned before in anything Roman in Jerusalem. But now that's been getting a lot more attention, and we're beginning to get a better handle on pottery dating. And once you can date the pottery types more precisely, it means that you can then identify remains associated with those pottery types. And that's part of what's happening now in ongoing excavations. It's one of the periods that I work in a lot, and I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, listen, the Romans destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. They kicked the Jews out, and the Jews are back, and the Romans are gone. So that's kind of what's happened. And so, but it is worth talking about what happened. When is this? What is it founded as a Roman colony, Aelia Capitolina, and what does the city look like at that time? And then eventually we'll get to Byzantine.
Right. What it sort of reminds me of that scene in Monty Python's Life of Brian. What did the Romans ever do for us? But anyway, so Aelia Capitolina was founded as a pagan Roman city by Hadrian, and Hadrian, his intention was not to build the city as it had looked before 70, but to lay it out along Roman lines. So it has all sorts of features that you would find in a good Roman city. It has a major north-south street, or actually, in the case of Jerusalem, two major north-south streets, what are called Cardo Maximus. In this case, there were two of them. A major east-west street going through the middle of the city, Decumanus Maximus, laid out kind of along a grid plan with other streets going north, south, east, west, creating kind of a grid of blocks. The city had somewhere in it was the camp of the 10th Legion. It had Roman features like a couple of Roman forums. It had monumental triple arched gateways marking, the entrances into these public spaces. So it had sanctuaries dedicated to Roman gods, to pagan Roman gods. There was a temple or a shrine dedicated to Capitoline Jupiter, who's now the new patron deity of the city. That's why it's named Aelia Capitolina. Capitolina referring to Capitoline Jupiter. Aelia, by the way, was from Hadrian's middle name. His full name was Publius Aelius Hadrianus. So the new city is named in honor of Hadrian and Capitoline Jupiter, the new patron god of the city. And there were other sanctuaries around the city that apparently were dedicated to different Roman deities as well. So and I mean, the material culture changes, the pottery types. There are new pottery types that are manufactured, Roman types of pottery that we've not seen before in Jerusalem, that were manufactured in a huge manufacturing center near the area where the Jerusalem bus station is now, the area of Binyanei Omah. So yeah, the city looked very different, and it wasn't just different in the way it looked; it was different in population, because Hadrian also, you talked about Hadrian punishing the Jews for the Bar Kokhba revolt. refounding Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, he also banished the Jewish population from living in the city of Jerusalem. So it's now a Roman city, not just in name and in appearance, but also in population.
Then we eventually get to Byzantine Jerusalem. For those that aren't familiar, just the Byzantine is the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. They split off, and then Emperor Constantine, he eventually adopts Christianity. That becomes the religion of the Roman Empire, and then so this really brings us to just to talk a little bit about Byzantine Jerusalem, and also this brings us to the churches and Church of the Holy Sepulchre and others that are in Jerusalem still today. These are much later, much later in reference to other things, especially the Jewish Yerushalayim. They come much later, but they're still there. And so, if you want to just say a few words about it in depth, this is in the book much more.
I'll just mention that so we've talked about how big Jerusalem was in the Herodian period, and it was, but Jerusalem was at least as big, not necessarily within the area of the walls, but in terms of the population, the extent of buildings, monuments, and all of that, was at least as big, if not bigger, by the time we get to the end of the Byzantine period, meaning by the time of the Muslim conquest in the 7th century. And that's because once Christianity becomes the legal and official religion of the Roman Empire, Jerusalem, which had been a backwater for the Romans, the Romans, and Hadrian rebuilds Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, but from the viewpoint of Hadrian and his Roman successors, and for the Romans in general, Jerusalem was not an important city. It was a minor, little provincial town with these people, the Jews, who have customs that are kind of weird and different from ours. That's their point of view, right? So once Christianity becomes the legal and official religion of the Roman Empire, Jerusalem is catapulted into a position of prominence that it had not enjoyed since the time of, the Herodian period, when it was, the capital of Herod's kingdom, right? And so what happens now is that Jerusalem becomes one of the most important cities in the Roman Empire, in the Roman world. And literally thousands and thousands of pilgrims begin to pour into the city. Clergy begin to pour in, monks begin to pour in. You get the establishment of churches and monasteries and convents all over the city. You get imperial patronage. For example, you mentioned Constantine, the emperor, building the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I talk about the Nea Church that was built by the Emperor Justinian. And so it just like the city explodes. It explodes in size. And it's, I wrote my dissertation on the Byzantine pottery of Jerusalem. It is practically impossible to dig anywhere in Jerusalem and not find Byzantine remains, because they were just everywhere, was covered with stuff, with ecclesiastical establishments, with, churches, monasteries, pilgrimage sites, tombs. We have lots of tombs to the north of the city. Very, very interesting. I talk about those as well. So it's really one of the major periods in Jerusalem's history, even if, let's say, it hasn't necessarily gotten as much attention as some of the earlier periods.
Okay, so that, and again, that's discussed more in depth in the book. Yep. And then you get into Islamic Jerusalem, especially early Islamic Jerusalem. So that's also worth mentioning here. Obviously, those that are familiar now, what's on the Temple Mount, they see the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock. You talk a little bit, and that comes from after obviously the founding of Islam, but they conquered Jerusalem in the 7th century. So this is much, much later already.
Yep, that's right. And so there, I have a long discussion of the Muslim monuments on the Temple Mount, including and mainly the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa Mosque, a little structure called the Dome of the Chain, which is next to Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's very enigmatic. And also a long discussion of a series of monumental buildings that date to this period that are located around the western and southern sides of the Temple Mount, which have been traditionally described as early Islamic or Umayyad palaces. And a sort of a long discussion. They're very interesting because until they came to light in archaeological excavations, and they were actually found in Benjamin Mazar's excavations after 1967, until they were discovered in archaeological excavations, nobody ever knew that these things had existed. And they're enormous buildings that were very richly decorated. So clearly for the first Islamic dynasty, the Umayyads, and I think also even for some of the later dynasties, Jerusalem was really, really important. And this is reflected in the monumentality and the lavish decoration of all these buildings. But I mean, I think that for many of your readers, even if they're not necessarily interested in the Islamic period or the early Islamic period, they will be interested in sort of the Dome of the Rock. And the Dome of the Rock is really interesting because it was built to broadcast a series of messages about Islam relative to Judaism and Christianity, to establish the position of Islam as a new religion versus the sort of older established religions, right? So there's a lot going on with the Dome of the Rock. I also, that chapter on early Islamic Jerusalem, that and Aelia Capitolina are two chapters that don't have a transition point, in the sense that they don't end with the year that the chapter focuses on is not a year when there's like a big destruction and then something terrible happens and, whatever. In the case of early Islamic Jerusalem, the year that I chose is 800. Which actually doesn't have anything to do with Jerusalem itself, but has to do with Charlemagne and Charlemagne's coronation, because Charlemagne was a great patron of construction and the Christian community in Jerusalem. And so I use that as kind of the segue into early Islamic Jerusalem. And there's a whole long thing about Charlemagne and Jerusalem in there that I think readers will be interested in.
Yeah, and just in general on the history of this period, from Byzantine and then Muslim, and then we're going to get to the Crusades. Last year I did an episode with Professor John Hostler, a book, Jerusalem Falls, that was published by Yale University Press, an excellent book on the history, not archaeology there, a history of this time period. For those that are interested, read that book and listen to that episode. And this one goes more more into archaeology, and you discussed also there's Crusader Jerusalem. There's you obviously have a chapter about Crusader Jerusalem, and then you end off with a little bit, like you said, with you end up with a walking tour and a little bit about today. It's interesting. You actually end up an epilogue about British Mandatory Jerusalem. Yeah, why'd you choose to end off that way? You jump from Crusader Jerusalem.
I know. It's kind of funny. Yeah. Well, I wanted to end. First of all, I thought I have this thing about Lawrence of Arabia. And Lawrence of Arabia, of course, was present when Allenby walked through Jaffa Gate. So, and he's got, I actually quote the description that he gives. And so I was like, oh yeah, it would be nice to be able to tie in Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, right, into this whole story. But also, I mean, what's really interesting is that the British public, when Allenby comes into Jerusalem, the British public actually viewed that as kind of the culmination of the Crusades. And the British media talk about what's going on in terms of the Crusader conquest of Jerusalem. And this is kind of, bringing it to fulfillment. And I thought that was a very nice way to kind of bring the book from the Crusader period up to more or less, the present day, or at least up to modern times, something that most people can relate to. So that was why I put it in there. And there's that iconic photo of Allenby walking through the gate. And I end up by talking about he dismounts from his horse and he walks through Jaffa Gate, and how this kind of ties in with centuries of precedent of, dismounting and walking into the city of Jerusalem, right, as kind of a show of piety. So I thought it was, even though, it's kind of a little bit of a jump, I thought it tied things up very nicely.
Yeah, and so that's really, like I said, what we really didn't get into, that the book goes into very much in depth, is all these different periods, the coins and the tombs and the monument, the monuments and the structures and different things like that. A lot of that history. The tombs is interesting because you have various tombs, and are they accurate or not, and that's archaeology. It's very involved, and the book does go into that. So today's Jerusalem, someone goes into Jerusalem today, which is obviously a massive city. You have the old city, the new city. It's really a massive modern city, and so. First of all, when we see the old city, when someone sees the old city, I know you've discussed and alluded to this earlier, but just to make it clarify very clearly for listeners, what is old? When is that truly from? When are the walls from? When is the old city? Most of what we see, I mean, obviously, there's many different parts. Right. But when we're looking at the city, taking it as a whole, when is that really from? The fact not the various. Of course, we're not talking about again the wall and the Temple Mount. Just in general, taking this as the city, as the old city.
Well, I mean, that depends on, you'd have to ask about a specific part or something. Look,
right, and the walls of the old city.
The walls, as you see them today, date to the Ottoman period, so the 16th century, right? Although the line of the wall, so in many cases they're founded on a line of wall that actually goes back earlier in date. So basically that line of wall, even though in some parts there may even be earlier remains, but that outline goes back roughly to the 11th century, right? Since the 11th century, that's roughly been the outline. Again, even though there are parts where in some places it may go back even earlier than that. The visual appearance of the old city today, as you walk through these sort of narrow, covered streets and markets, a lot of that is actually Crusader. And I cover that in the Crusader chapter, which is having these covered markets was a Crusader thing. And in many places in the old city, those covered markets are still preserved intact, and you can walk through them. So the visual appearance of the old city today, a lot of it goes back to the time of the Crusades. Even though the Crusaders were in Jerusalem for a relatively short period during the entire span of the city's history, but they really did leave a lasting mark on sort of the way the city looks.
It's really fascinating reading the book and hearing about the history of Yerushalayim. And I don't know if there's another city in the world that has such a history of, even though you have Rome, which is ancient, but Rome didn't have so many different people coming there and building it and conquering it and building it and rebuilding it. And Yerushalayim, Jerusalem really has this rich, amazing history. And then, till today with the new city and what it is now, is that true as an archaeologist historian? Is it unique?
I actually do think that Jerusalem is unique. I don't know. I don't know if I would say that Rome is less complex because Rome is bigger, and the same with Athens. And I've spent a lot of time in Athens, and I've worked in Athens. But I guess packed into that tiny area, yes, I think it probably is more complex than that, but it's also different. I mean, Jerusalem really is unique. It's not like Rome. It's not like Athens. It's not like Istanbul. It's not like Alexandria. It's not like these great ancient cities of the Mediterranean world and the Near East, in that it was important not because of its location. That is, it was never on a strategic route, trade route or anything like that. It's not on a waterway. It's an isolated mountain town. It's not so easy to get to. And so Jerusalem's importance never derived from the fact that it was a major node for, international trade and connections and all sorts of stuff like that. To the contrary, it actually was not. But rather because of the religious reasons, right? Because it became identified as the place where the presence of the God of Israel dwells. That is a concept that is still alive today, and where ultimately the last judgment, the final judgment, will take place, right? And so many people have characterized it as a temple city. And that really is what it is. So it's not really analogous to the other major cities that we think of the Mediterranean world and the Near East in that way. It really is special. It really is different.
Yes, it's unique. The Beis HaMikdash was there and will be there, Mr. Shem. And so that's really where that's really the I could say the holiness and the.
That's right. When you go today to the wall, to the Kotel, right? You see people taking little slips of paper with prayers and folding them up and putting them into the cracks. Why? Because that's as close you want God to hear your prayer, right? Because that is where his presence dwells, right? So that concept is still very much alive today.
Right. One doesn't. Well, I was going to say, some other cities. Obviously, I was going to say Rome, but Rome, there's the Vatican for Christians, but it's different.
That's not
the same.
No, it was no. And by the way, I mean for Christians, I mean the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. See what happens and this is I talk about in the chapter on the Byzantine period. But what happens is that their focal point moves from the Temple Mount, which I should mention, by the way, in the Byzantine period was lying in ruins.
Yeah,
Byzantine Christians left the Temple Mount lying in ruins because they saw that as a visual fulfillment of Jesus's prophecy that the temple would one day be destroyed, and as a visual illustration of the triumph of Christianity over Judaism. So they left the Temple Mount lying in ruins during that period, and they then shifted the focal point for them from the Temple Mount to really a pretty short distance away to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which they venerate as the spot where Jesus was crucified and buried, right? But still, for them, Jerusalem is that important spot. I mean, that's right.
Which I believe you discussed also the accuracy or inaccuracy of that, if that's accurate or not. And then, and I also should walk that back, because Rome also would be only for Catholics, not for Protestants or other parts of Christianity. So, yes, Jerusalem is really unique. It's definitely unique in that way. And as you say, it's really, for that. So let me just ask you, as an archaeologist, as someone that's been there and you just were recently there, what's your favorite spot in Jerusalem the ancient Jerusalem to go to? Do you have one? Maybe there is none.
I don't know. That's like asking a mother to choose their favorite child or something. I'm not sure I have a favorite spot. I do in the book, in the guided tours at the end, I mention a number of places which I recommend people visit, which are a little bit off the beaten track. And so one of my favorites, it's not my favorite, but one of my because I don't think I have a favorite, but one of my favorites is the Alexander Nevsky Church, or the Russian Alexander Hospice, which is next to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And a lot of people, they just walk by it and they don't realize it's there. And if you go down into the basement, you can see the remains of one of the forums that Hadrian built. And part of the original, it was originally a basilica that was built by Hadrian, but was then converted by Constantine into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The most of what's left of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, most of what you see now is Crusader. Most of Constantine's church is gone. So there you can actually go down into the basement. And I like it because it's kind of, it's a little off the beaten track. I just have to mention, it's in this beautiful building. It was built in the 19th century. And there's this giant door. I mean, it's like this huge double door. And there's a sign outside that gives hours. And now their hours are a little more regular, but for many years, the hours seem to have like no relationship to reality. So even if you went there and it said they're supposed to be open at a certain time, they weren't necessarily open. But what I would always inevitably do is I would walk by is whether or not it said that the hours were open, I would knock on the door. It's this big knocker, right? So knock on the door. And then if you were lucky, the door would kind of open and it would be like in The Wizard of Oz. Like this guy would peer out with big mustache, and if you were lucky then that you could pay your 5 shekels or whatever and then go down into the basement. So I like kind of those kind of things that are a little bit more off the beaten track. And I like to take, groups with me to, visit these kind of sites. So that's one of the places that's on the itinerary. So again, not necessarily my favorite, but just something that's a little different from what most people visit.
So just in closing with this book, who would you say this book is meant for? Who did you gear the book towards?
When this persistent editor, Stefan Vranka, persuaded me to write the book, the original vision was that it would be a trade book. And so that meant, aimed at a wide readership. As I was writing the book, I got into the weeds. I mean, I found myself, it's weedier. There was no way that I could make this very complex story of Jerusalem simpler. And so what I tried to do is to give, the information, but to explain it as clearly, and as easily as I could. But there's still, it's still very long and there's a lot of information. So it came out, I'd say, I hope it will reach a broad readership. It did come out at a little bit, I think, a higher level because of all the information than just like somebody casually picking up a book and saying, oh, I'm just going to read this for fun kind of a thing. So I think that overall the audience is going to be a sort of an educated, fairly educated, interested audience, not necessarily with background knowledge of Jerusalem. I think it's also ideal for students, whether they're undergraduate or graduate students or seminarians, for scholars in related fields, biblical scholars, let's say, or, scholars and historians who aren't necessarily specialists in Jerusalem. And even for some archaeologists who specialize in one of the periods, but maybe not some of the other periods, and want to look up, some background. And it is, as you know, it's got a lot of footnotes. It's got a very long bibliography. So hopefully with all the references that people who want to do more research on their own or track down specific pieces of information, they can do that. So I like to say it came out weedier than it was originally envisioned, but I couldn't make it any less weedy.
Right, then you'd be really dumbing it down if you did that. And
Right.
there's countless pictures. Some are, like I said, there's in the middle, there's a color section, but throughout every chapter has pictures of the coins and the tombs and the locations and the archaeological digs and things like that. So there's pictures all throughout. And it's interesting. It's a blend, I would say, of history and archaeology. Although this podcast, we kind of focus a little more on the archaeology, but it's kind of both. You do lay out the history and then go into archaeology and discuss that. So it's really, if anyone wants to learn a little bit more of the archaeology combined with the history of Jerusalem, of Yerushalayim, and they can, they should check it out, and I'll link to it in the show's notes. And thank you, Professor Magness, for joining me once again.
Thank you for having me.